Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Sarah Liz. I'm so excited to show you this card. It has bold, clean lines on the front and a pop-up on the inside. It's like all of my favorite things and all my favorite colors because I couldn't help myself. This is the pop-up Hummingbird set from Spellbinders. And so I've cut out the bird and like the wings and pieces for that. And then there's also a flower that will go on the inside. For the outside of the card, we're using the Hummingbird card creator, which makes a 5x7 shape card, and the Hummingbird sentiment stamp set that coordinates. I have an A2 card base, side folding, and then I have also cut a piece of light blue cardstock that is 1/4 inch smaller on all sides. Okay, so that is 4 by 5 1/4. That's what I meant for it to be anyway, and that's the one I start with. Top secret, I pulled my card apart after I put the inside together. You're going to watch me put it back in there with the right way with a card insert that's not quite the right size. So just a heads up on that. Learn from my mistakes. Worth it. Totally worth it. If I make an interactive card that doesn't get torn apart at some point, you're on the wrong channel. So I am just taking my Hummingbird. So on the sort of top left, you see the pinky purple, right? And it's going to fold in half. So you see the Hummingbird from both sides. And I've ink blended some magenta ink just to like the head and those tail feathers. And then I added a little bit of my teal as well. So I have sort of a pinky gradation and then a hint of purple. That's the same blue I used on the outside edges of my flower. This is the belly of the Hummingbird, and because there are two sides of it, right, that's why we have two bellies and then the two wings. And I'm just going around with some gray ink to give that just a hint of shadowing, some variation in color, and then some dark purple. This is the inside of the pop-up flower, okay? So here's our bird, and I am just sticking my thumb right into the score line. I will fold it the wrong way first, just a little bit, and then back on itself. I find I get a crisper fold that way. And I'm adding a little bit of glue. There's an embossed line on the bird to show you exactly where that belly is going to line up, and it's going to sort of rise right up. So there's a little bit of that blue up at the throat of the bird, and I will do both sides there. Next, we are going to add the beak. These are teeny tiny little pieces. These are the only matching pieces for either side that are going to get glued together. I have added a tiny little dot of glue where the beak attaches to the bird. And then when I flip this over to add the other one, I'll add the glue all along the sort of back side of that beak. And because they're getting glued together, it's actually pretty sturdy on there. I was worried about how little of it is overlapping the bird, touching the bird. Not a problem. You will also see in the final photos, I changed my mind. I made the beak gold. There's hints of silver and gold throughout the card, and I just, changed my mind. There is a tiny little dot that is cut out using the dies, but I decided to use a tiny black gem instead, but either way would work. I think the little die cut might have been easier, trying to get my gems to flip over so that I could pick them up. That was a challenge. So here is the beginnings of my Hummingbird, and I'm going to add my wings. There are not embossed lines for where to add the wings. There are a few pieces that have flexibility depending on where you put the wings. The bird sort of looks like it's in different positions of flight. And then when you go to add the bird into your card, you can actually change the angle of where it's going to be in there. So it can look like it's flying straight up. It can look like it's about to go feed on the flower, right? And here is our Hummingbird. I just put those wings so that they're sort of matching on either side. To put our flower together, once again, we have some embossed lines. I'm kind of pointing them out for you. And I am going to just stick my thumb right into those embossed lines and fold them toward me. Okay, and then there's one that's all by itself, one little petal by itself. I'm going to add my glue there, and I will overlap it with the first petal on the other side. So then when I fold the whole thing in half, there are two little tabbies down at the bottom, and I need those tabs to line up. That's how it's going to be when the card is closed. All right, so that's also how we're gonna insert it into the card and create that pop-up mechanism. I'm doing the exact same thing with this next smaller layer. I'm overlapping the petals on the end and then folding it in half. There are score lines there and making sure that those tabs line up. Here I used some brushed silver cardstock. This is the thickest cardstock I'm using for the flower. The other two are 65 pound. We're going to be layering up all of those tabs and then folding them back. And so if you're using 100-pound cardstock or even 80-pound cardstock, that's a lot of layers for a very small tab. So actually I highly recommend like a 65-pound cardstock here. I've added glue to the 2 tabs of my largest flower and I am setting the middle flower inside. I did not add any glue to the tabs of the middle flower. I'm just trying to get it so that the outside layers are glued to the middle layers, okay? So even though my tweezers are on there, there is a layer right in the middle that is not glued together. This is my card base, and then the little sort of matte layer that's going to go inside. This is going to hide the mechanism. And here is the die that cuts holes to pop up our hummingbirds. There is a tiny little sort of raised bit. That's the middle of that mechanism. I'm using some temporary tape and lining that up. And then I wrapped it all the way around and used a Sharpie to draw a line on the back side of the die. So I knew exactly where the middle of that die was. I'm going to line that line up with the crease in the middle of this matte layer. And I'm just going to set my elements here so I know that everything's going to fit inside the card. I know I want the hummingbird on the bottom, and then these tabs are going to go into the holes cut by this die. Well, if I line it up where the die is now, you can see it's going to poke out the top of the card. We don't want that. So I'm bringing my die down, just finding the placement, and then I will tape that down. Again, I'm lining up that Sharpie line, the middle of the die, with the score line in my matte layer, and I will run that through my die cutting machine. Then we will repeat that process to create a second set of notches for our hummingbird, right? And those will go right down at the bottom. If you don't want to create an entire matte layer, there is a second die that goes right around that rectangle, and it will create like a little tab that you can glue into your card for each of the pop-up elements. I think it makes them really visible. It makes the mechanism stand out, so I like this way better. I'm adding glue to the inside of my 2 flower layers, and now I'm adding that third layer that has the stamen, I think, right? Tell me if I'm wrong about flowers. Let me know in the comments, but I'm adding that piece, and I'm going to use my tweezers to make sure that dries really well. It's shiny cardstock. And once that's dry, I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to fold these tabs back. I have 3 layers of cardstock I'm folding back. Then I am going to insert those tabs into the 2 notches we cut towards the top of the card. And I'm going to fold it shut, and I'm going to kind of pull the tab and then fold it towards me, right? So the crease of the card is at the top, and I'm folding it towards me. I added a little glue underneath it, and then now I'm adding some double-sided tape just to hold it in place. If those notches come loose, the flower won't open when the card opens. So again, now I have that crease towards me, so I am pulling slightly on that tab, and I will fold it away from me, okay? So the notches are being glued facing towards the outside edges of the card. Next, I'm going to add my hummingbird. So again, I'm folding the tabs up towards the hummingbird, and I will set them into my card, and I'm kind of looking inside. Like, you can change the angle of where it is in there once I find it. Okay, that's looking good to me. Again, I will sort of slightly pull those tabs towards the outside edges of the card, and I will glue it. This is much easier because there's only 1 layer of cardstock. The glue is probably enough here, but I'm impatient. So I'm going to add my double-sided adhesive once again, just to make sure that it's going to stay in there. All right. So then here's where things get a little bit funky. This is actually the second time I inserted that blue layer with the pop-up mechanism into my card. I am using a solvent-based adhesive because I don't want this paper to warp, and I am using, again, a 65-pound cardstock just because there's so many layers. This is kind of thick, right? So I'm going to glue in one side of the card. I'm going to press the creases into each other. Okay, so far so good. I get good wiggle room with that adhesive, and so I'm double checking the margins, and you can see there's a larger left margin than I wanted. We'll fix that later. And then I'm going to add adhesive to the other side, and I will fold the card shut onto it. I definitely want to make sure that my card will close, right? And so I'm pressing it, and here's where you're going to watch me put heavy stuff on it, because the first time I did all that, and then I let it dry while it was open. And so what happened was I ended up with like a wrinkle in that blue layer that wasn't super noticeable. I'll point it out here in a minute. This is now, we're looking at the original again, because I wanted to show you how to add this purple piece. I added dots of glue just to the tips of the flowers. It's not getting glued to the card, it's getting glued to the silver layer of cardstock there, right? So I'm just going to wiggle it into place, and I will press it shut and kind of hold it until that takes. And that will finish our pop-up flower. And it pulls open and pops open really easily. I have another video where I made this hummingbird shaped card using the Hummingbird card creator. I will link it below. But when I was making that, I actually made 2 blue shaded hummingbirds. So that's what the large hummingbird shape is, and why I'm not showing you the shading on that. But you can see that in the other video if you'd like. Then I have all the pieces that I cut to go onto that hummingbird to build up the pieces. And I'm just doing some real quick ink blending. So I have added ink. This is sort of the inside piece of the belly, the straight edge, not the scallop part. That's going to be right along the outside edge of the belly of the card, okay, or the hummingbird shape. And so since there's ink blending on the light blue panel, I wanted all of my pieces to feel like they had a little bit of that same shading. I wanted to use the same colors on the outside of the card that I used on the inside of the card. So this is just a little bit of a pop of pink that matches the pop-up hummingbird inside. And I really love how it kind of ties everything together. There are 2 pieces to the belly, so I'm going to layer those together. I found that was easier to center before I added it to the hummingbird. And then I will add that to the large hummingbird shape. There is, again, sort of a scored line, an embossed line, to show you where that goes. When you start putting all the pieces, the head and beak together, I like to start with this crown piece because not everything butts right up against each other. Some of it does and some of it doesn't. And when I started with like the beak and the neck, things got weird. So I've added the beak, and it nestles right into the crown. And then here, the neck has a little notch that also nestles into the beak. But you can see how the neck and the crown don't touch each other. So just be careful of that. Then there is like a little piece for the eye, and I will add that with a tiny dot of glue. And that was it, right? This is really quick and easy to put together. We could put this in a 5x7 envelope, right? We could create a hummingbird shaped card, and it's huge and really stunning. But I wanted to cut it down to make it fit on the front of this card. It just was easier to make the whole thing instead of just part of it. I have cut out a bunch of little gold leaves. They're also in the die set, and I'm going to add those around the outside of our flower. I just felt like I wanted to bring in the gold from the beak to the inside of the card. So I'm doing it here, and then again at the end when you're looking at the photos of this hummingbird on the inside, you'll see that I changed its beak to gold as well because we're fancy. Also, I have to note that these leaves have little cut lines for all the veining, and they're so pretty. Like, the level of detail put into all of these dies is incredible. There's some wonderful debossed detail in the wings and the tail feathers of both the large hummingbird and this smaller one. Okay, so all of my pieces are put together on the inside, and I'm folding it shut, and when I open it, you see that? There's a wrinkle on the inside, and I hemmed and hawed. That's when I tore it apart. I put it back together. You saw me mostly put it back together. So on the front of the card, I'm using a card panel for this because I don't want to mess up at this point. I have a piece of shimmery white cardstock that is really thin. It's a 65 pound. And so I'm using my Beacon 3-in-1. It's a solvent-based glue to add this just to a piece of 100-pound white cardstock. I want this really sturdy. I'm adding panels both to the front and the back because I'm extra. And I want the card to open and close well. If I was going to add a bunch to the front, I wanted to balance that weight on the back. So I'm placing my large hummingbird and just kind of seeing where it's going to fit on here, and it leaves the perfect spot for a sentiment. And I am using the Hummingbird Sentiments stamp set that came out with this whole collection, and this one says, "Happy birthday to beautiful you." If you haven't checked out this whole collection yet, I'll link to the individual products below, but you can also just search for Hummingbird on the Spellbinders website. It's so gorgeous, and people have made the most incredible things. So give it a look. You don't need to buy it, but at least look at it because it's so amazing. I am going to stamp this happy birthday in the bottom right corner. So I've put some acetate over my card base just to make sure that everything is straight and lined up the way I want it to be. And then I'm going to add a ton of anti-static powder because it's a shimmery cardstock, which to me is a little finickier than regular cardstock. I end up with more stray embossing powder. So I am using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. It is a pigment ink, and it's going to stay wet for a little while, but it also stamps better onto this slightly glossy cardstock. And then I'll just add some clear embossing powder over the top of that and heat set it to make sure that that ink isn't going to smear. I was kind of worried about that, but I wanted the crispness that I get from that VersaFine. I'm double checking it after I heat emboss it because sometimes it's hard to tell if it's melted, especially on a shiny cardstock where that shine is coming through. So I did it a couple times just to be sure. I have cut 2 more of the Hummingbird Card Creator large hummingbirds out just on some heavyweight white cardstock. And I am going to layer those up with the one I've built in color. I thought about adding foam tape, but I didn't want it to have saggy pieces in the middle, and I don't know. This just seemed sturdier and slightly less dimension than foam tape would have given me, right? It's just a hint of a shadow, and I really loved that. So I'm gluing all of that together, and then again, I'm just checking the placement before I start adding glue to the back of my hummingbird. I want to make sure I don't have so much glue that I'm going to end up gluing all of this to my desk. And I will add that to the top of my card. I'm also going to then take this to my trimmer to remove the extra pieces of the bird. That took some doing. That's a lot of cardstock. So use your good trimmer. I learned that the hard way. Use your good trimmer. Then I'm going to add my card front to my card base. Again, I'm using my Beacon 3-in-1. I get good wiggle time. And then once that Beacon 3-in-1 dries, it hardens a little bit, like it stiffens up that layer on the front of the card and makes it super sturdy. But it's also why ultimately I ended up adding another panel to the back using the same adhesive so that it's not like the front is super stiff and the back is a little flimsy. Once it's all straight, I'm going to press and hold it, and then once it's dry, I open it back up, and I thought I was done. But you can see that extra space on the right and the left, and it was really bugging me. So I cut some strips of gold mirror cardstock. This matches our beak on the front and the gold accents on the inside. And I thought that I was just covering up an oops, but in the end, I really love what that does to elevate the inside of the card. And this is it, right? Clean, bold lines on the front, and then this beautiful pop of color with our hummingbird and the flower on the inside. I hope you like this card. If you do, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I will see you next time.